Hey folks, back again. This time we have Ian Seabrook, freelance writer, journalist in general, and previously editor of Retro Japanese magazine, but probably best known nowadays for Hubnut on YouTube, where he celebrates the average. And with that in mind, he is joining us because we are decidedly average. Welcome, Ian. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
That's superb. So I'm just going to dive in straight with our first question, which is, as ever, why cars? Why are you spending your time with cars so much?
Oh, I don't know. The obsession started very, very young, and I would pester my poor mother because at the age of 4, I was identifying cars walking down the street. I wanted her to tell me more about them. She knew nothing about cars. She didn't drive, so it was a bit tricky. But I had an aunt who had old cars, Morris Minors and Oxfords, when I was growing up. And they were deeply unfashionable in the 1980s. So I guess that's kind of what helped me develop my niche of going for cars that most people aren't interested in, and that is very much my niche.
Yeah, very much so. What was your first car that was actually your own?
My parents bought me a Mark II Fiesta when I passed my driving test, which I managed to gently destroy over the coming months. But the first car I actually bought with my own money was my second car, and it was a 1984 Citroen 2CV. And
Ah,
that's an obsession that has stayed with me forever.
yeah. It's interesting that we've been doing these podcasts for a little while now. Since annoyingly, we planned to start doing them before all of the COVID insanity happened, and
Hmm.
and suddenly that happened, and we were sort of been interviewing people since kind of March, and the amount of people that's first cars or one of the first cars was a 2CV is surprisingly large. I would not have thought of it being as many as it is.
Yeah,
Uh,
well,
what,
they were Group One insurance. They were cheap to run. They are just hilarious. You've got the roll back roof. You've got the roly poly suspension. The fact you can just thrash them mercilessly all the time. They are ideal first car fodder.
I guess they're also pretty easy to fix up and repair and all that kind of stuff for someone that's not done any of that before. Did you get stuck in straight away on that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I had my little toolkit and I would get stuck in. But I mean, even now, sort of many years later, I think it's currently 24 years since to the day since I got my first 2CV. And yeah, I still don't really know what I'm doing, but they're very forgiving cars generally, and I seem to get away with it.
Getting away with it is all you need to do.
Mm.
Um, so you are still a car journalist.
Hmm.
What was your route into that? Like before all the Hubnut
Well,
days,
th-
what were you up to?
there were two things that helped me build a portfolio of work to try and blag my way into the media industry, so to speak. One was writing for the 2CV Club magazine. I had a monthly column because my friend was editing at the time, Chase Racer, who has been about on the Retro Rights forum from time to time.
Mhm.
And I was also doing stuff for what is now the AR Online website run by Keith Adams, and it was eventually through Keith Adams that I got my foot in the door on Classic Car Weekly, and spent
So
over
that
3 years on that title.
I was gonna say that. So that was your first job was Classic Car Weekly.
My
Um,
first job in this area, yes.
yeah. Were you doing anything vaguely motoring related beforehand, or were you sort of
No.
out doing randomness?
The closest it got to motoring was a few short stints working at car dealers as a van driver and working at an insurance company, and that was as close as I got to cars before that point.
That's fantastic. So yeah, route in via kind of car clubs and occasionally a bit of the right networking with the right people gets you into the right place. So what were you first writing for Classic Car Weekly?
I it all began when I sent a piece on spec to Keith, and I said it was a response to a feature Nick Larkin, fabled writer, had written on saloons, and I wrote one about estate cars because I just love estates, and that was my first published piece of work. And then there was an odd bit of freelance after that, but I then became the features writer and would spend many happy days trawling through books to put together features on the motoring exploits of people like Eric Carlson, Pat Moss. and the cars they drove as well, and it just absolute joy from doing that sort of work.
That sounds like an absolute dream. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, it was. I mean, everyone thinks it's all about the driving cars, and yes, that's nice. But if you haven't got the love of writing and research, then yeah, it's probably not the job for you.
No, that's yeah, that does sound like a bit of a dream for us sort of nerdy car people.
Mm.
Uh, you ended up as editor of Retro Japanese. So how did that magazine come about? Were you the were you pushing that? Because I know you have an interest in that sort of thing, or did they come to you?
That all came about through Phil Whedon, who was the um, boss at Kelsey Media. He's always had a strong interest in Japanese stuff. He has a Honda S2000 himself. At the time, Kelsey Media had a Subaru Impreza project car, and it's a niche. He could see what was going on. I mean, the growth in that side of things. As the nostalgia kicks in, we get into late 70s, early 80s. The Japanese cars were taking over the market, so we could see it was going to be a growth area, and we hoped that title would be able to make use of that. But while the interest was there, it's not yet really backed up by industry. There aren't too many big specialists in Japanese stuff, and ultimately that and the difficulties trying to make a magazine actually work financially these days meant it came to an end last year.
Yeah, it's a real shame. It's a real shame. As you say, you could see the broadly see a market there for it, but
Mm.
it was like not necessarily all the right pieces in place yet, and yeah, perhaps almost a little too early, but then also in a very difficult time with
Yeah.
magazines in general. So
Yeah, yeah, and I think the late, we've now lost Modern Classics magazines, which are far more
disappointing.
established. So yeah, it is a struggle, a very real struggle, and it's a shame because I love that title because I was able to give a voice to people like Dan Hurst and Eddie Ratley, whose depth of knowledge is frankly slightly terrifying,
Oh, it's
and
shocking.
I
It's
I I,
amazing.
I I loved it to proof because I would learn so much every time I read one of their features. So it was really nice to give them a window and an opportunity.
Yeah, it was a great title, and it was nice for us to see sort of familiar names from our little world,
Mm,
getting a bit of exposure, and people perhaps outside of that seeing the depth of not just knowledge but passion for these things. You know, these guys
yeah,
are super passionate about these cars and have been since before the internet went all JDM. It was that they've been there for years, and it's great that they're about. And I'm glad
yeah,
that you at least gave them the opportunity to do that. I think.
and you have to be passionate about the Japanese stuff, as you well know yourself. Getting hold of parts for cars that were really commonplace, sort of 30, 40 years ago, it can be an absolute nightmare. So yeah, hats off to anyone who owns a Japanese classic because looking after them not always easy.
No, no, it's yeah, it can be a labour of love at times. So alongside all of this, somewhere along the line, Hubnut appears. So how did
Mm.
that come about? When did you decide to do that, and what format was it in? Has it always been YouTube? Like I just suddenly became aware of you doing this. Like I've known you sort of for a while, kind of thing, but then
Yeah, let's
suddenly
not talk numbers. It's embarrassing.
yeah, it's a shocking amount of time. But then, like suddenly, you're much more famous even than I, and I don't know when that happened.
Yeah, well, it was
Or
it was
why it did.
over.
Like, how did it all come about?
Yeah, it all began with I had a blog called Classic Hub, and Classic Hub was something I set up when I went freelance in 2010. So I left Classic Car Weekly. I was working freelance for anyone who would pay me, but still, I just had creative urges, so I would just write features about what I wanted to write about. And if no one had published them, I put them on Classic Hub. And I started a YouTube channel then, oddly began because I had a Nissan Leaf on test and I'd never driven an electric car and I somehow wanted to capture the process. So I just stuck a camera in the car and talked to it. And that started me off with that. So I then did a video on my Land Rover Discovery, on my Daihatsu Sirian, which I absolutely loved. And it was very, very much a hobby. And it was a few years ago I decided because I had an interest in classic cars and electric cars, that Classic Hub wasn't appropriate, and the Hubnut name just came to me one day as a sort of an evolution of Classic Hub. so a way to link to that, but be somehow a bit more generic. And off we went, and it was always just a hobby, just to make the videos. But as I could see the magazines starting to struggle, and the pressure editors were on to try and make these things work, I started to think that maybe finding my own solution to videos was the way to go, because the bigger publishers struggle to make a profit. But I thought, well, perhaps there's enough profit for a one-man band. And it was only February 2019 that I went completely full-time on Hubnut.
So
So
yeah, a year and a half now you've been doing it full time.
yeah, and I guess in the 6 months up to that, I was pushing it really, really hard, because I was starting to think this is my escape route.
Yeah,
And yeah, thankfully it's been very well received.
yeah. It's really impressive that you've worked so hard at it and found your audience. Now I know some people may know this. I am friends with a certain other YouTube car celebrity, a chap called Shmee150,
Oh yeah.
who I've known before. He was famous because he used to work for me, or work with me, I should say. And it was interesting to me how hard it was that he was working at that stuff even in the beginning. Like, he was out every single night, and you can see also in your videos, you're constantly working. And I think it's sometimes hard to get across to people how difficult it is and how much hard work it is to build a YouTube channel. Like, were you aware of that when you started going down that path, or did you suddenly find
Not
yourself making
really.
videos every day and going, oh,
Yeah,
this is kind of hard work?
it just built up and built up, and of course it's not just the making of the videos. It's dealing with the comments, it's dealing with emails and queries coming in, trying to do business deals, because I've had sponsorship on the channel at times. There's an awful lot going on, and then we started selling merchandise on the back of the website, because we realised the YouTube income alone wasn't going to be enough to live on. So we started doing a few stickers, and they sold out in no time at all. The stickers enabled us to do T-shirts, and the T-shirts sold out quickly, and everything has kind of built up. And now the Hubnut merchandise is almost a little business all of its own.
Yeah, this is definitely seems to be how these things build. Is that in order to get to the next level, you sort of introduce something, but that then and of itself becomes its own thing.
Yeah.
We have a car show business that runs alongside a website now, rather than a website that has the odd car show, and we do the merch. And I've got the same kind of experience. It's like, oh, you do this little thing because you want to move up a little bit, but then it just becomes a whole thing you now have to deal with every day,
Yeah.
and it's, it can be more than a little time consuming, but it's great.
Indeed. Yeah, I've helped organise events. I know what hard work they are, and that's just doing one off, not doing it every single year, because you don't really get to rest after you've done one. You've got to immediately start thinking about the next one.
Yeah, always planning, but I'm really like proud, not the right word. I'm really happy that the Hubnut stuff has worked out so well for you, because
Oh,
it's
thank
given
you.
you a chance to indulge your passion for the slightly more obscure, celebrating the average, as you say. It's
Indeed, yeah.
which I don't think you can do in a magazine. I think that's one of those. It's one of those weird things that really only works on the internet.
Yeah.
In that the audience is big enough out there for it, but it's so diffuse, and they're not all going to buy a magazine. But everyone will probably have a quick look at YouTube
Well,
nowadays.
the other thing is, to make a magazine work, you've got to have advertising. And if you're doing a magazine about cheap cars, people aren't going to be attracted. That's not a sexy thing to advertise in, is it? So
No.
it's going to struggle on that count. And then you're trying to sell a magazine on cheap cars to people who've got cheap cars, presumably because they haven't got huge budgets. So are they going to buy a magazine?
Yeah,
Whereas,
and
YouTube is free at point of use, and the advertising, as long as I'm not doing anything controversial, YouTube don't care what I make videos about. So
no.
in some ways, they're the best publisher I've ever worked for, because there is no pressure. You must do this car, you must do that car, and there's no pressure on sales. I want to get good views for my videos, but I will still do videos on the cars I want to do. I'm not chasing views.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the things that YouTube has allowed people like you, and there's other folk out there in their own niche, in their own world, to just concentrate on the thing that entertains them,
Yes.
and hope that the other people that are entertained by that find them and subscribe and all that kind of thing. And I think
Yeah.
that passion just bleeds through really well on it.
Yeah, and it's a great way of finding people who share your passion. I've now got over 60,000 subscribers who presumably have the same outlook on cars as I do, and that's just extraordinary.
It's nuts, isn't it? It's great. I love
Yeah.
it. Let's talk about your cars for a little bit because you have an interesting car history.
Hmm.
And you're known for your Invacar at the moment, your 2CVs, obviously. But first of all, I want to talk about your Alpha 164 V6 because it seems
Oh,
slightly
yeah.
at odds with all your other cars in that it's kind of this sort of executive, throaty thing.
Oh, yeah. I
And
mean, it was a beautiful car. It sounded absolutely glorious. But you got to remember, I bought it when 164 prices were rock bottom. I paid £375 for it. And it even had working air conditioning. And
good lord.
it's one car I should not have sold. But at the time, I didn't understand brake systems. It had a seizing caliper. So I sold it for probably less than I paid for it because I'm an idiot.
Hey, like I said, we've all been there, but yeah, we
Mm,
got rid of cars that we just sort of almost too afraid to fix at the time.
in,
Um,
indeed.
how was your Alpha ownership? I've owned Alphas, and it's always an interesting journey.
It was absolutely fine, apart from that brake caliper issue, which was just the same sort of brake caliper issue you'd have on any car. It was just seized up a bit and needed freeing off. I know now. Um, it worked fine. Like I say, air conditioning worked. All the electrics were absolutely fine. The 164s are a very, very underrated car, which makes them prime Hubnut material.
Yeah, yeah, I suppose so. I suppose so. It's yeah, they're a beautiful bit of kit as well. Now I think they've aged very well. The 164.
Indeed, yeah. There was one at the weekender last year, gorgeous red cloverleaf, but I'm still desperate to get my hands on and do a video on.
I will. I can hunt that down for you if you want.
Oh,
I
it's all right.
definitely.
I'm already onto the owner. It's just
That's
Adam. We're
good.
trying to make the logistics work.
Ah, yes, yes, yeah, yeah. Tell me about it.
Mm,
It's one thing that's been much easier in lockdown is actually recording podcasts, but also I don't have to work out what I'm doing this
hmm.
Friday or this weekend because it's nothing. I'm not doing
Yeah.
anything. So, come on, tell us about the Invacar. This is an iconically Hubnut vehicle. We
Well,
brought it
yeah. I
to the
mean,
weekender and all that stuff. So.
the Invacar came at a time. I mean, it really drove growth on the channel because no one had ever done videos on them. But it basically an invalid carriage built in the 1970s. Mine's a 72. Um, I found it in a field of 14 of them in Sussex, and I took two of them, one of which has since been restored by a friend of mine. And yeah, the build series on restoring that car after 14 years sitting in a field and getting it back on the road, yeah, it's been extraordinary. And at the moment, I'm just preparing a highlight reel which shows some of the adventures I've had in it since getting it back on the road. You bear in mind, it's got a 500cc air-cooled flat twin engine from Austria, bizarrely, a CVT transmission, so belt drive. And yeah, the adventures we've had in it, thanks to Retro Rides meetings, we've been round Goodwood Circuit, we've been up Shelsley Walsh. It's just extraordinary. And people absolutely love it because it's such an adorable little car and such a forgotten piece of sort of very British history. I'm very glad we've moved on because it is absolutely lethal. Driving it in crosswinds is terrifying. And I have actually had 70 miles an hour out of it on the way to the Retro Rides weekender
Good
on the
lord,
A23. That
that
was very
sounds
scary.
that sounds like one of the most terrifying things in the world.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. But yeah, I just love it. It does so much more than it should have done, while also being quite a lot rubbish. I think we've come a long way as a society, thankfully. But it's a very important piece of our history, and I love having the exploits I have with that car.
I think it was it's interesting as well with YouTube and to a certain degree forums. It's novelty kind of rules the day in many ways,
Mm,
and the Invacar is very much a novelty car. But out of that novelty, you're able to show, as you say, like this was an important bit of history for the car industry in the UK, and just exposing a thing that no one like really bothered to look at very much outside of what I imagine is a small pool of fairly crazy enthusiasts.
indeed, yeah. And through that, there's many friends of mine have now bought Inver cars, so we're kind of forming our own little society. And yeah, it's really good to see newfound interest in this forgotten bit of history.
Yeah, they're an odd sort of an odd thing. They used to be everywhere as well. I remember when
Oh yeah, yeah.
I was a kid, you used to see them everywhere. But
Well, this is a remarkable thing. Mine was in service, I think, until 2002, 2003, when the scheme finally ended. And I don't think people realised it went on for that long.
no, bloody hell. Actually, I have a question from Dave Smith, the editor of Street Machine, because
Hmm.
we chain our questions through our podcast, going all the way back to the first. And it dovetails nicely with this. Have you? What car have you owned that has earned you the most sort of scorn or derision? Given that you have an interesting array of cars in your
Oh
past.
wow, yeah, this is a difficult one because I've had about 70 cars and most of them have been awful. I mean, it's worth remembering when I first got my 2CV in 1996, it was a joke car. And, even years later, Clarkson was still making jokes about 2CVs. They were not seen as a serious classic car in classic car circles. They were just a point of derision. But I got into 2CVs. Well, they were nice and cheap because of that derision. And yeah, it's one where during my time owning them, I've really seen the respect grow. And there was a good thing about going to retro rides meets is you had that respect very early on, even when the classic car world were turning their noses up at 2CVs a bit. So yeah, that was definitely one derided car. But
Yeah,
you,
that's a. I was going to say that that's an interesting change over time. The
mm,
acceptance of the classic car community to stuff that was thoroughly derided. It's like Skoda. Like
yeah,
you get a 1000 MB Skoda, and that'll happily go to any classic car show now. But what 10, 15 years ago, probably been asked to leave.
oh yeah, if you turned up in a Skoda Estelle, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, the world becomes a more forgiving place perhaps over time. So remember that, folks, when you're if you're starting out and looking at cars and thinking, "God, this isn't cool," it will be eventually.
it will
Probably,
be, yeah,
probably.
maybe.
So, what are you currently driving?
The only two cars I've got on the road at the moment are my 2CV, which I've owned for 20 years next month, and I've got a Citroen GSA. They're both C plates. They're both air-cooled Citroens. So I'm very much putting my trust in the Citroen gods at the moment.
You're, yeah, the French have a habit of turning out kind of interesting cars. I'm
Mm,
gonna use the interesting word again. They're both sort of technologically interesting,
mm.
but also a little bit odd. I find. Does that
Yeah,
what
yeah,
attracts
and
you to them?
yeah, oh, very much. The GSA is like nothing else. I mean, for years I've been going on that I want a big car ride in a small package, and it's like, well, why didn't I get a GSA earlier? But I think the timing's right now because they're starting to gather a bit of a classic following. So there's better part support than perhaps there was 10, 15 years ago. And yeah, it's a lovely car to drive with a completely wacky dashboard that looks like nothing else. All the controls are, you just get in and you're just like, well, where are the column stalks? And there aren't any. It's all rotating switches, and the speedo is a rotating drum as well. So it's very peculiar, but
I
lovely
love
to
it.
drive.
Love it. That's brilliant. Have you got any? Is there anything you got your eye out for? Are you happy with those two at the moment?
Well, still got plenty of cars in the shed. I've still got my Daewoo Matiz. Again, there's a car that often gets derided. Reliant Fox, and I've just got a Yugo Sana, which is probably going to be my winter project to try and revive. There are not many Yugo Sanas left, um, so yeah, there's plenty to be keeping me busy.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And I think I need to try and fix those projects rather than acquire more. He said, hopefully.
It's the constant cry of the car enthusiast.
Yeah.
So, is there a white whale out there for you? A car that you kind of really desperately would like, but have never been able to pin down?
Yeah, I think, well, it's not so much pinned down as a Ford, but obviously being a Citroen man, for many people, the Citroen SM is the absolute pinnacle. And what could be a bigger nightmare? A car with hydraulic pretty much everything, but a Maserati V6 engine that sounds like a race car and kind of needs looking after like a race car engine, and just fabulous dramatic looks. This 17-foot long, really a two-seater because the rear seats are so rubbish. It's just you have to question what they were thinking at the time, but they are marvelous.
Yeah, they're a beautiful bit of kit. I occasionally see them come up for sale in the States. They seem to be popular in the States somehow because there always
Mm.
seems to be at least one or two for sale out there.
Yeah, they did sell quite a few over there somehow.
Yeah, I don't understand what their thinking was and all the people that
Mm.
were buying them, what they were thinking, but apparently they were popular and occasionally eye them up because the prices are a little bit cheaper than they are in Europe, I guess, because of the supply.
Mm.
And then you just remember everything. And you
Yeah,
think,
yeah, it'd be a great way to lose a lot of money fairly quickly, I
yeah,
suspect. Yeah.
yeah, perhaps best not do this.
But that's what makes channels like Cold War Motors fascinating. Is he's I think he's got a couple of SMs, but he's sort of covered the reviving of, and just prove that if you're willing to just dig in and have a go, it's all very different, but it is possible.
Yeah, I think there's props nowadays. There's almost like a better world for these kind of cars because
Mm,
whilst there's only perhaps a handful of people that know what they're talking about, you can definitely get in touch with them. Whereas back in perhaps the late '90s, that would not have been a possibility at all. And I think that's what's helped with the Japanese car scene. Actually, going back to people like Ed Ratley, is
mm,
if you do get stuck, you can find Eddie or someone else that knows what they're talking about and
yeah.
ask them a question. Whereas that wasn't always the case.
No, no, and I mean you can now buy parts directly in Japan and stuff like that, but it just wouldn't really have been possible.
No, it was yeah, it's incredible to me how those people kept things going, and it's the same with like all the guys with the Eastern European stuff that
Mm,
they've managed to keep going all these years because they got a similar kind of scene going on that's quietly in the background, but now like it's all become a lot easier to get parts. I have a friend of mine who has a bit of a Yugo fetish, and
mm.
that's become a little bit easier over time, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. I need to plan a Serbian holiday so I can go get some parts for my Sana.
Yeah, bring back in your luggage.
Mm.
So let's have a look. I've got a selection. In fact, actually, Dave Smith sent me two questions, and I was going to pick one, but actually, I'm going to pick both. Um, what forgotten car do you think is least deserving of its obscurity or indifference?
Ooh, well, yeah. A few years ago, I would have said the Citroen 2CV, but times have changed and people are recognizing just how good the engineering is in them now. So yeah, ooh, that's a really difficult one. I think Pete, we've mentioned the Eastern Bloc stuff, the Trabants and Wartburgs. Again, another car derided for a very long time, but actually the engineering, especially given the constraints of the times, I think they're actually very impressive cars.
Yeah, it's impressive how many are still on the road as well.
Indeed, and that's largely due to their sheer simplicity.
Yeah, yeah. I think that having gone from the Citroen SM to the Trabant is, I think, yeah, from one of the most complicated cars ever built to one of the simplest. And there's a
Mm,
reason one of those is plentiful on the road, and the other one you don't necessarily want to touch with a barge pole.
yes, yeah.
You're recently you did I think what would be my choice for that would be the Isuzu 117 Coupe you
Oh
did on your
yeah.
channel. I'm a big fan of those cars, and I don't think they deserve to be as obscure and odd as they are.
No, no, and I was absolutely blown away by the driving experience because it's an incredibly competent car and a real pleasure to drive. And I wasn't necessarily expecting that because much as I love Japanese stuff, especially 1960s, early 70s, they were still some way off the mark a lot in terms of dynamics. The handling would often be quite woolly, the ride would often be somehow crashy and bouncy at the same time. But yeah, a very competent package.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I found that in the UK that or European cars were sort of built to have this dynamic driving experience,
Mm.
almost regardless of what they were, because of the way they were getting reviewed. And then the Japanese cars were just quite competent, but not necessarily entertaining, which I think is part of the reason why they get derided so much, like my little Sonny and stuff.
Yeah, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that the Japanese weren't just influenced by Europe; they were very much influenced by America, and they knew
Yeah,
what worked in America. And to be honest, cars like the earlier Cedrics would have been very well received in America because they behaved like American cars. But obviously,
yeah.
that's not going to appeal to Europeans.
I think that that's actually a really interesting point. That they basically built European-looking cars that drove like small versions of American cars, and
Mm,
it's an odd mix, the sort of slightly wallowy ride in a small European car.
yeah.
So, how are you picking out cars? I mean, as I say, you got that Isuzu, which is just magic to me. How are you kind of deciding what is going to go on the channel and
So
that sort
so
of thing?
much of it. I mean, I will go hunting for certain cars that really tick my own boxes, but a lot of it is people offering cars. And remarkably, that Isuzu lives about 10 miles away from me,
Oh,
and sometimes that happens. There's some amazing stuff hidden up in the hills of Wales. I'm really annoyed I didn't get to do a Mazda Unos Cosmo before the owner sold it. Just time and circumstance were against me. I featured it in Retro Japanese magazine, so I did get to drive it. And what an extraordinary car that is! This enormous executive coupe that somehow sounds like a Porsche 911 and a Wartburg at the same time with that triple rotor engine, just absolutely crazy. But I never got time to go back and do a video on it, and I very much regret that. But yeah, it's a case of people offering cars, and I'll go, oh yeah, that's very much something I want to do, and then just trying to get the logistics to actually do it. So when I recently went to New Zealand and Australia, I was offered cars all along the way, but there were some massive gaps. So I didn't get offered any Australian Chryslers to drive other than a Neon. So there's a regret there, but I didn't experience more of that. I didn't experience more 1970s Holdens and Fords. It all tended to be 80s, 90s. So yeah, sometimes it's frustrating because you don't always get offered what you actually want to drive.
yeah. That's it. There's only a certain amount of time in the day, so if people are offering cars, I guess you're more likely to take that, given that you're only going to be like the Australia trip. You're only going to be there for a limited amount of time, so you
Yeah,
kind of take what's offered rather than having time to hunt stuff out. If you
indeed.
can
So yeah,
feel,
it's a combination of the two. Like I say, there are cars I'm definitely hunting for, that I definitely want to do videos on, and there's cars in the past that have very much been of that nature, or even buses. I drove a Leyland National bus to mark 30,000 subscribers, and that was major box ticking exercise. Unfortunately, one advantage of being an old person, so to speak, is that I can drive a 30-year-old bus on a car license. So that was
yeah.
a very interesting experience. But that was one I had to try and find someone who was willing to let me, an inexperienced car driver, drive their bus.
How was the? Like I said, I'm sure the video's out there, but how was that for you? Like, was it
Oh,
as
it was
terrifying as it
amazing,
sounds?
but it was so difficult to actually try and do the commentary, actually do the video bit, whilst trying to drive a bus. I mean, buses are huge, and we thankfully did it in Lincolnshire on roads that were very well suited to driving a larger vehicle because it's all truck routes really. So, but you're still having to concentrate a lot. You're just trying to squeeze through towns. It was a fascinating experience.
That's unbelievable. So good. You drove a tractor as well. I saw
Yeah, yeah,
recently.
yeah. I stopped with someone who let me drive a tractor around in New Zealand. That was quite an interesting experience as well. Didn't realize how complex they are. You
I
know,
got,
each gear has sort of four sub gears. It's extraordinary.
yeah, I saw a map of a gearbox in. Well, it was a truck gearbox, but I'm guessing the tractor is similar. So you'd put it into like first, and then you'd put it into like first, and then second
Yeah.
first, and then third first. It's like, oh my god, this is
But
insane.
yeah, the four sub gears almost behave like little overdrives. So you don't have to use the clutch or anything. You just pull the lever and you're into the next fraction of that gear. Yeah,
That's
baffling.
that's wild. That's
Mm.
little bit of extra respect for those guys.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah. Next time you're getting held up by one, going, come on. Yeah.
you can just go. I know you got
Just
16
think of the
gears. You can go
engineering
faster.
instead.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
apply the
yeah.
engineering, or the slightly overloaded trailer, which is what we have around here at all times.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. Fair bit of that. It's that time of year.
yeah, you're also you did a Porsche 911, which this is what I quite like about you. Not quite like, it's what I love about your channel is you're doing sort of this obscure Isuzu and that you
Mm.
got your 2CV, like there's an ongoing thread through it all and all of this kind of thing. But then it's not so almost blinkered. Like I think people that can be into sort of quote unquote unloved cars can be
Mm-hmm.
at the expense of every other experience of a car. But you're also there. You're driving the 911 and stuff. So that was great to me. How was your 911 experience?
Yeah, that was a really interesting one. I stayed with a chap, ever so nice, called Ian in Wellington, and he let me drive his Chevrolet Corvair, his Audi TT, and his Porsche 911. Huge fan of the channel, despite owning those three cars. And but I think the 911 really qualifies for Hubnut because you look at the package as it was in the 1980s, and it's just ridiculous, really. This air cooled six-cylinder engine slung out the back. The whole feel of the car is very old school, very classic, very 1960s. Yet here is a car that is still lauded today, and certainly gives a very unusual driving experience. There is nothing else that drives like a 1980s 911.
Yeah, they put the engine in the wrong end for a start. It's all gone
Mm,
horribly wrong. They're a very, as you say, they're a kind of a unique capsule of time that seemed to catapult all the way up to, well, I guess 1998 when they went a bit more water cooled
mm,
and sort of redesigned it a little bit and put the engine in a slightly more proper position. Whereas the older ones, yeah, all the way up until then seemed to almost like doggedly be determined to do this thing. It's like
mm.
you're not going to dissuade us. We're doing this. This
Yeah,
is
yeah. It's amazing that they just stuck with it. It's and fair play to them because it's worked really well. But
yeah.
that car really didn't make a lot of sense. Just driving around normally, it's got a clunky gearbox, and it doesn't actually feel that punchy. It was only when I got it onto a twisty road in the hills that I really understood what the car was about because it just corners insanely well because there's no weight over the front wheels, so the steering's nice and light, and the traction you've got coming out of bends with that rear engine, yeah, it's just amazing. You just have to be a bit respectful of it, but it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
car you have to drive to really understand it.
It's weird, isn't it? So, long time sort of listeners of the podcast will know I have a 996. It's the Porsche no one likes, and it's very nearly back on the road now.
Mm.
But I have no ties to Porsche or 911s or any of that stuff. I didn't grow up wanting one. I will make a video at some point explaining why I have this stupid car. But I love it now.
Mm.
Yeah, it's one of the four-wheel drive ones, so just because it's a little bit more tractable, it's quite nice like that. But as you say, until I drove one, until I had one, I didn't get it, and now I get
Mm.
it. I'm not like an insane Porsche person by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't think I ever will be. But it's like, okay, yeah, like you have like a weird light bulb moment, I think, with them, which is quite nice. And I guess, as you say, it's getting the right car on the right road. So,
Yeah.
is there any other sort of weirdly light bulb experiences like that with vehicles? You've gone, actually, this is kind of more than I thought it was.
Well, the Isuzu was definitely one of those. That was definitely better than I expected. But weirdly, it's actually the other way around. It's. I mean, you talk about right car, right roads. The amount of times I end up in the right car on the wrong roads, like trying to drive an Alfa Romeo GTV V6 around Sydney, and it was just awful because I couldn't extend the engine, I couldn't experience the handling. It was quite crashy over the poor road surfaces. I was just like, I'm not seeing the best of this car.
No, it's a shame, isn't it? It's
But when you only have a window of a couple of hours, you're very much restricted by the geography.
yeah. That's a real shame. I think that, as you say, like you've got a window in which you get to experience a car, and
Mm.
getting it in the right situation isn't always possible in that time. Like some cars are purely brilliant on track, for example, or on a very twisty country road. But if you don't get them there, you don't kind of necessarily understand them, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah. Actually, fourth gen Honda Prelude, I had one of those a few years ago, only the 2 litre automatic. But I remember I was a bit late trying to meet some friends in the Midlands. And just to add to my woes, I ended up taking a wrong turn, trying to take a shortcut. And I ended up driving down these beautiful, sweeping Shropshire roads. And that car really came alive. The steering is some of the best power assisted steering I've ever encountered. And that was one of those moments where just like, oh, yes, I finally understand this car. And the rest of the time, you're getting annoyed because it's a crashy ride, uncomfortable seats. But yeah, on the right roads, that car was an absolute dream.
The Prelude is another one of those series of oddly Japanese cars that I mean, the
Mm,
Europeans did a little bit of, but like the Cosmo as well, they had these sort of big executive coupes that were just very, I don't know, very of the time.
mm,
I quite liked the whole series of them. Like you had the Sora, and Nissan did the Leopard, and I guess the BMW E31, if I get my numbers right, kind of counts in that the 840 and all that sort of stuff. These sort
hmm
of big executive coupes that don't really seem to exist anymore.
Yeah, but the Prelude was always small. It was a
Oh yes,
small executive coupe. It attracted a very niche market. But writers like the legendary LJK Setright, he absolutely adored Preludes because he understood what they were all about. Yeah, I think a lot of people probably wrote them off because the Japanese can't do handling, so it'll be rubbish, and never got to experience just how great they are.
yeah. I think they're getting a little bit of a resurgence. All these sort of Radwood people and all that kind of stuff,
Mm.
like the 80s and 90s preludes, because they're so perfectly encapsulating of an era of both cars and Japanese cars in general. I think that's quite nice. So that's one of the things that I quite like in a car that encapsulates its era
Oh yeah,
wonderfully.
yeah. I mean, going back to Honda again. Yesterday, I was driving around Swansea in a Honda Accord Aero deck, and just the styling is just so 1980s. And for me, it was the absolute high point of Honda around that time because there's superb engineering. It works very well just as an ordinary car, but actually, it's quite nice to drive from an enthusiast point of view. And the looks are just screaming 1980s. And very 1980s look at the future.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's another thing I like. I like cars that look like they were trying to be from the future, but they're like from the future of the 1960s, which
Yeah.
like doesn't quite. It didn't quite happen, but they I don't know. They still look like space. Like the French cars, obviously, all look
Oh
like
yeah.
spaceships.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the DS, when you actually sit down and look at a DS, especially around the back with the indicator trumpets and everything, it's just an insane looking car. It's absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, it's wild. There's the CX as well, actually, that sort of
Mm.
followed, which I feel is a little bit more maligned than the DS, but
Oh
will
yeah,
have its
definitely.
day.
Yeah.
Just as complicated, though.
Oh yeah, just as complicated, if not more so, with the Diravi self-centering steering. The first 10 miles in the CX are probably some of the worst miles you'll ever do. But once you understand it, once you get used to the weird steering, they are extraordinary cars.
Yeah, one day maybe. I like the CX estate just because they're just insanely large. They're just a
Yes, yes, I had
ridiculous
I had
car.
a familial because obviously a chap who's on his own with what one partner really needs an eight-seater.
Yeah.
So I had one of those a few years ago, and it was a remarkable car. But yeah, I started to feel I was pushing my luck with it, and the electrical issues started, and I thought, right, time to get out of this one.
Yeah, it's knowing when to pull the ripcord on certain cars. The
Yeah.
electrical issues on French cars and Jaguars, and I generally find weird fueling issues on Italian cars, and it's time to just go.
hmm
No, this is fine. This can belong to someone else now.
Yeah.
So, what's the most surprisingly good car you've had? Something which I guess we kind of touched on with the Isuzu and stuff, like
Mm.
things that the sort of I don't know, you didn't have any expectation for, but then you came away going, oh, you know what, that was all right.
Um, Oddly, the Ford Puma is probably one. I haven't actually done a video on it, but I did get lent a Puma by a friend, and everyone goes on about, oh, it's a great car, but I kind of get a bit annoyed by it. I've driven a Ford Focus and I thought it was okay. It didn't blow me away, but the Puma was just extraordinary. It just begs you to absolutely thrash it constantly. It's an absolutely remarkable car, and I, even though I knew to expect it to be good, it was somehow managed to be better than I expected.
It's interesting how much that's flown under the radar because,
Mm,
like, I mean, I'm aware of the Ford Puma, and I always thought the Cougar was a better looking car. Sorry, Ford
mm,
people. And I thought that was much maligned, but
yes.
it's interesting that how good the Puma is. Then I have to investigate a little bit
Yeah, and
further.
I think people write it off because it's got cutesy looks. They think it's going to be like a Vauxhall Tigra. It used to like the MX-5s. I mean, you still get people claiming MX-5s are hairdressers' cars, and you're like, well, clearly you've never driven an MX-5 quickly because they are a joy.
Yeah, well, I learned the other day one of my favourite bits of trivia is Christian Koenigsegg that owns Koenigsegg.
Hmm.
His summer car is a Mazda MX-5, and
Oh wow.
he loves to drive it because it reminds him that they've got to build cars that are fun and not just fast.
Mm. Yeah, that is my big problem with faster cars. I think the frustrations came out nicely when I drove a Honda NSX a couple of years ago. I think I genuinely had more fun driving the chap's Honda Accord Coupe first gen than I did driving the NSX because the NSX isn't a fun car to drive slowly. It's only fun when you're absolutely on it. But by the time you're absolutely on it, the speed is getting definitely the wrong side of naughty.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, as I said, there's cars that you can only really get the full enjoyment out of on track. Otherwise, you're
Mm,
basically constantly looking in your rearview mirror for the police and or just being an idiot on the road, which we
yeah,
don't
but
appreciate.
the MX-5 isn't a particularly powerful car,
No.
so it's not the power that's making it an enjoyable experience. It makes nice noises, but I mean, you look at the speedo, and you're not going particularly quick, and that's where the enjoyment comes from.
I think that there's a phrase of slow car fast, which I think
Yes.
is it's a great little phrase for stuff like that. That you're going to get more enjoyment out of those things. And
Oh yeah.
sure, I don't know, your mate might have some 400 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower, whatever fire breathing thing, but it's not going to
Mm.
be as much fun. Like on a
No.
day to day basis, it's not as enjoyable.
No, the
Yeah,
amount of fun I've had in my 2CV over the years is extraordinary. And if you go back to the Retro Rise weekend of last year, the people trying to tackle the auto test in really powerful cars and sort of struggling because by the time they got the turbos spooled up, they're at the next cone and they've got to slam the anchors on. Whereas my mate in the 2CV van,
yeah.
on the door handles every cone, and the crowd loved it. They were having an absolute whale of a time. And there you go. It's a 602cc engine with 29 brake horsepower.
Yeah, exactly. It just it again right car, right place, but also you don't need oodles of power just to have fun with a car, and in
No.
sometimes it will work against you. So
Mm.
that's definitely I think an appreciation. On the subject of MX-5, my mum had an MX-5. An
Hmm.
exciting story about my mum's MX-5, which I'm now going to
Oh.
share with podcast listeners, is she sold it in 2007, and it is now in the Mazda Heritage Collection.
Oh,
And
wow.
I know this because it turned up on the cover of Classic and Sports Car. I was like, that's my mum's
It's
car.
not the white one, is it?
It is the white one.
Oh, well, yeah, I have driven that one.
You've driven my mum's car.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah. It's a lovely example.
It is really nice. Low mileage. Yeah, she bought that. I
Mm.
think she was the second owner. She used to come and pick me up from Sainsbury's and that when I
Hmm.
used to work in Sainsbury's.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm going to try and get down to Mazda Heritage. I really want to have a look at their Cosmo because that's my
Mm.
dream car. The
Oh,
Cosmo
yeah.
Sport.
I've tried talking them into letting me out in that, but understandably, they're a little reluctant because they are one of those cars you definitely don't want to bend or ruin it.
No, no. I think somehow I'm going to have to find the funds to buy my own, but they seem to be going up and up in
Mm.
value faster
Frightening.
than I'm finding funds.
Yeah, but yeah, I have got a video on the MX-5 because Mazda invited us to Silverstone to drive all the generations back to back, which was a very interesting experience. But
How much have they
yeah,
changed? I guess that's spoiling the video, but
yeah. I
we'll
mean,
have to.
the main issue is that I don't really like the later ones because they're full of technology, they're heavier, and just can't match even just the exhaust note. We changed between the Mark One and the Mark Two. The Mark Two felt very muted to drive afterwards, even though it had slightly more power. So I really do think a Mark One MX-5 is definitely the car to have, and I think collectors are starting to cotton on to that as
Yeah, definitely.
Rust claims them and the numbers dwindle.
Yeah, I think that for a car that was completely ubiquitous in some manner, it's going to be
Mm,
one of those of, oh, you don't see those anymore,
yeah.
and the prices will go up.
Mm,
Sadly, my Sunny is one of those cars that was completely ubiquitous at some point. They disappeared off the road, but sadly the prices haven't gone up. So
no.
I need to get myself an MX-5 as an investment.
But yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of Japanese saloons, especially in unfortunately entirely original condition, that they are starting to fetch strong money. So I've
Yeah,
seen
for
a
sure.
lot in the world of Toyotas, especially.
Yeah, Toyota's definitely gone up a lot more than I think most of the other brands.
Mm,
It's surprising what you can pick up at what I would say is reasonable money. And we're not talking the sort of £500,000 you used to be able to pick them up, but they're not kind of classic car money for a lot of these
hmm
things. And then just occasionally you'll see a Toyota for sale, and it's £35,000. You're like, oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
happened then.
but even Carina E's, really nice examples. They don't fetch strong money. Like this is insane.
Yeah, yes, it's wild. I think that you can't regret not buying these things because sometimes you couldn't really predict it, but other
Mm,
times you kind of think I really should have bought a couple of them and just held
yeah.
on to them for a bit. Ah well, what's sorry, I had the obvious counterpoint to the surprisingly good cars, which was what's surprisingly bad.
Ooh. I think, and I reflected on this when I was recording the video yesterday. Vauxhall, the FE Victor, not really a high point.
Oh, okay.
Partly because I think the FD is an amazing looking car, and the FE just didn't quite follow on. But also, it sort of represents how Vauxhall was really losing its independence entirely by that stage. The structure is mostly an Opel, but they're a car that somehow managed to just be fairly uninspiring to drive. And compared to, say, a Mark One Granada, yeah, they just don't quite feel on it. And I hate saying that because I'm always championing the underdog, but it's one of very few cars I struggle to get that excited about. And I was looking at a beautiful example yesterday, one I've actually done a video on quite a few years ago, and I'm just thinking I don't really have any desire to drive that car again.
That's interesting. It's funny sometimes you can almost chart like the rot in the British car industry sort of
Mm,
through the cars themselves. So like I know there's
yeah,
lots of stuff happening at the boardroom level and industrial level and within the country societally as well and all this kind of stuff. But you can kind of chart it through the cars sometimes. They gradually become less and less inspiring
yeah.
in broad swathes. Like some companies still manage to keep it going, but others you're like, oh yeah, no, you can see how this all fell apart.
Yeah, but Vauxhall in the 1970s was definitely struggling. I think the HC Viva just didn't really move the game on from the HA and HB before it. And I think a certain amount of it is just laziness. It's just like, oh, this car is selling well, so we'll just restyle it a bit and sell more of them. But the rest of the world was moving on. You look at the development of Toyota Corollas and the Datsuns of that era, they were coming on in leaps and bounds. And the British motor industry wasn't really.
No, my dad told me a story the other day. He had a Morris Marina for a few years, a car much maligned, but
Hmm
this was sort of, I guess, mid to late 80s when they were sort of rock bottom prices. That was my dad's sweet spot.
Mm.
And they broke down somewhere in Wales in it. And the guy that came to help them was from Birmingham, and he went, "Oh yeah, you need to replace this bit." And my dad was like, "I had chatting to him, like, how do you know that so quickly?" He's like, "Oh, I used to work on the production line," and they came out of the factory with the wrong part, just because
Yeah.
we had them in stock, so we fitted them, and
Mm.
we told them that it wasn't the right thing, and they were like, "Well, we've got them in stock, and we need to get rid of them," and it was that kind of really brought home. I'm sure that's not an unusual story from that era
Oh
either.
no, no. I mean, I was reading on Keith Adams' excellent AR Online website just the other day about the Maestro, which was effectively kept in production purely because what else were the factory workers in Cowley going to do once they'd started making the new Rover 200 at Longbridge? And it's just insanity, really.
Yeah, just mad stories. There's, I mean, there's many books covering it, but it's a super interesting kind of microcosm of the breakdown of
Yeah,
an industry. It's
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
I could talk for hours on the subject, and you probably want to stop me.
No, I'd never want to stop you. It's fascinating though.
Yes.
This is the sort of thing. But as I said, the fact that you can track it through the cars as well. Like, I didn't
Hmm.
know that about the Maestro staying in production. That's absolute madness. That's
Yeah.
insanity. But you also have to think it in the larger terms as well. Like German car manufacturers and Japanese car manufacturers were eating up this market because these people were
Yeah.
being crazy.
Well, yeah, and it's a real shame because you look at Rover's relationship with Honda, and that benefited both companies enormously. But the downside was Honda learnt an awful lot during the 80s from their involvement with Rover. And then they started scaling back on it because it's like, oh, well, we've learnt what we need to know now, thank you. And we're able to make their cars much more European centric from what they learnt.
Yeah, but it's almost a shame that Rover didn't take lessons away about building super reliable, easy to manufacture cars.
Yeah, yeah.
And gradually descended. Oh, British car industry, why? Why were you like this?
Mm.
That's a shame. Right, let's move away from the vagaries of the British car industry. We're sort of running down. We got another 5-10 minutes here. So
Okay.
you drive a lot. There's so many questions I've got to ask you. It's
Hmm.
ridiculous. So let's just go for road trips because that's always a nice thing for people to take away. So
Hmm.
what do you look for? You drive around the place a lot, and I'm guessing mainly
Mm.
you're driving to feature cars and stuff. But will you pick
Sometimes
a
it's just
route?
Yeah, sometimes it's just for the adventure. Like driving the 2CV to Croatia last summer was very much just for the crack of driving my 2CV to Croatia. I did find cars and test them along the way, but it was primarily about that particular adventure. And I bought a Ford Fairmont in New Zealand and drove it all around both islands. That again was very much for the adventure, just for the box ticking, really. And
Mm.
I just love road trips, just that every day something new. And it can be stressful when you're trying to find somewhere to stay, something to eat, and not run out of money. But I just love the romance of the adventures and the people you meet. It's just extraordinary.
I liked we interviewed Amy Shaw, photographer, a little
Hmm.
while ago, and talked to her about road trips because she does a few of them. And she said the difference between a road trip and just going for a drive is the element of danger. Like you could break
Yeah.
down in the middle of nowhere, or as you say, run out of money or something. I
Oh
quite like
yeah.
that idea.
In New Zealand, there were times I was on the west coast, which is notorious for its inclement weather, and I was getting trapped by road slides. And
Jeez.
you're just like, where am I going to be sleeping tonight? Where can I actually get to? And that became seriously quite scary.
Wow. Well, yeah, you get the story. I guess
Mm.
no one made a story that particularly interesting by just driving to the shops and back. So
Well, quite.
yeah,
But
so,
yeah, I
well,
mean, you don't have to go gallivanting off to other countries. The adventures I've had driving around the UK in my Invacar, I took the Invacar back to the factory it was built in. And remarkably, the chap who runs the garage that's in there now did his apprenticeship at the factory. So he was able to talk about the cars. He was able to sell me some new old stock spares he still had sitting on a shelf.
that's amazing.
And you just think if you don't go out there and have these adventures, you don't get to have these utterly remarkable experiences.
Yeah, yeah. You come back with a story, and that's
Mm,
the one. Whether you share that or not, that doesn't matter. Like it's the growing of the story that came out of the road trip. I was going to ask how meticulously you plan your road trips, but from the sound of getting trapped and not knowing where you're going
yeah,
to
yeah.
sleep and running out of money, not very.
I'm not a planner. I mean, I was generally booking Airbnbs perhaps a day or two in advance because you can't leave it too late with an Airbnb because these are normal people with normal lives. They're not hotels. You can't just turn up unannounced. So you have to give a couple of days notice. But yeah, I find that makes it more fun in a
Mm.
way. Just
Yeah,
to only work a couple of days ahead and say, oh, I'll probably be in that area in a couple of days. We'll see how it goes.
So you got a destination and I guess a block of time. You're probably a little bit freer than most people in that you are what
Mm,
you are. You're a self-contained unit, but
mm.
you've still got other responsibilities in your life. So like when you did the Croatia trip, did you know how long that trip was going to be, and then just work out what you were doing along the way,
Oh yeah,
well,
I'd booked the ferry out and the ferry back, and there was a 5 week gap between the two, and I didn't really know. I had a vague idea of going to an event in France and to the Netherlands, so yeah, I spent several weeks just driving all over the place. Really, it was brilliant.
that sounds like an absolute dream. That is superb. I'm gonna just throw in, as I tend to towards the end, a couple of my emergency questions. Not that
Hmm.
I've needed them here. Um, what is the fastest you've been in a car?
Fastest I've been is 130 miles an hour in a Dodge Viper on a supercar driving experience, which I booked after I crashed my Subaru Impreza and realised I had no driving skill whatsoever, and decided I actually needed some.
That's very kind of interesting. That also comes back a little bit to that right car, right road, and also right
Mm,
ability. I think probably needs to
yes.
go in there. Um, you know, there's always a temptation to want the really fast car, but like if you're going to end up backwards in a hedge, or if you're a bit more sensible and you've taken it on track and end up
Mm.
backwards in a sand trap.
Well,
Um,
it becomes an issue for journalists, especially classic car journalists. You're expected to sound really knowledgeable on these cars and what they're like on the limits, but you don't get to drive them on the track. You only get to drive them on the road. So yeah, you can't really go around pushing the limits, especially in older cars, because yeah, the potential for catastrophe is rather large.
yeah, I guess it's worth that's a good tip for journalists, particularly if people entering the field or wanting to get into stuff. Learn how to drive cars properly.
Yes.
Go on an advanced driving course, or if you're feeling particularly flush, I believe Mira do a like super advanced driving course that they use for
Yeah,
training.
well, even when I went to that Mazda MX-5 driving day, they had someone. We were in the latest MX-5 on track, and they had a racing driver who could teach you how to get the best lines and where you should be on the brakes, where you should be on the power. That was massively useful.
Yeah, that sort of stuff is great. I know a lot of track days and stuff do that, and it's almost worth doing those in your normal car
Yeah,
because you're used to the car, you know the car, but having someone explain to you how to get the most out of it is, yeah, it's often surprising as well. You think you're a good driver. Everyone thinks they're a good driver.
yeah, and until it goes wrong. But I did a track day last year in a Mazda 323F 1.5 at Silverstone again at Japfest, and 90 brake horsepower, and I was having an absolute riot because all the people in the fast cars would be fast on the straights, but then they were all, very ginger going around the bends. But I was absolutely going for it, tires squealing every bend because
Brilliant.
it hasn't got enough power to get you into trouble, and it's just fairly safe handling. So yeah, go for track day. Don't think, oh, I need to get an Impreza to go track daying. No, just go in any old hatchback. You will learn so much.
Yeah, and it's good for you. I think it's good for you to understand where those limits are. The
Yeah,
other,
yeah, and you can still crash even without power. I saw
yeah,
a bog standard Yaris suffer lift off oversteer and spin off the track. So yeah, you can learn very, very quickly. And at least in the Yaris, you're not actually going to be going that fast. You're probably not going to go smashing into a barrier or something.
no, exactly. The other excitingly humbling experience I had was I went to Goodwood and they had a slot free in their afternoon BMW experience thing.
Oh wow.
I was there for a meeting and they were like, "We've got a slot free. It's there and we would like to fill it." And that they gave it to me cheap, which was nice.
Oh,
So I just stayed and did this. It was a very, very nice treat you get occasionally when you organise these car shows and stuff.
makes up for the
And
lack of sleep.
it makes yeah a little bit, and I sort of drove this car, and you got the instructor with you, and you drive around. It's a really good experience. I thoroughly recommend it. Anybody and all these supercar experiences and stuff, they're good fun. I enjoy them. So the racing driver's giving me instructions on going around Goodwood, and then they drive the car, and you think you're a quick driver and you know what you're doing,
Yeah,
and then they're like 3-4 times as fast as you, and all they're doing is the same thing you're doing, just much much quicker. And
yeah,
but it's interesting. It's a really good measure to remind you sometimes that whilst you think you're a good driver when you're out on the roads, you probably could be a lot better, unless you're one of these guys, in which case you can
Indeed,
definitely
and
go.
with that Mazda at Silverstone, I very quickly learned that a car that felt wonderful on a twisty Welsh road felt a bit at sea out on track. It's like suddenly it just feels out of its depth, and that's a very interesting experience as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, go and use shots. And again, I just want to point out this is one of the other things I love about you and your channel is you embrace everything. So you have
Mm.
you like somebody might put you in that whole sort of festival of the unexceptional kind of pigeonhole, but you aren't. You're everything, and I love it. So
Yeah, I'm a car enthusiast, but I do tend to stray away from powerful stuff just
hmm,
because I find it so hard to enjoy. I guess it's because I'm used to low-powered cars, so I'm used to being able to exploit every bit of power those cars have on the road. And you put me in something with a V8, and I'm suddenly I'm getting annoyed because I'm hitting the speed limit in second gear. I'm thinking, well,
yeah,
what's the point of all this power? I can't use most of it. So yeah, like you say, the less is more really when it comes to
yeah,
power.
yeah, definitely. Particularly in the UK, our roads are quite small,
Mm,
but also like there's so many other people cover all that stuff, and they're all right.
yeah.
You
Well, yeah,
know,
you
if you
mentioned
like it.
Shmi already. I'm
Yeah.
not ever going to set myself up as a Shmi rival. He's got
No,
his niche, and I've got mine, and they are very, very different worlds. And
and
that's the
but
beauty of YouTube is that we can
that's
plow our
exactly,
own niches.
and that's what I love about YouTube. Like the you've got people that like whatever it is they like, and they can
Mm.
just put it out there and hopefully find an audience, or not. Like they're just happy to put it out there. You know, I mean, we do not have a lot of subscribers, but we still put stuff out.
Yeah, and you have to do it for the enjoyment. I did it for years purely for the enjoyment of doing it. I didn't think even a few years in that it was going to one day be a full-time job.
Mm.
You have to do it because you love doing it. And if you're going into YouTube thinking purely commercial, you're just going to end up disappointed because it took me 6 years to get to a stage where it was bringing in a reasonable income, and
Yeah,
even that is far from plentiful. It's not a bountiful amount of income. It's kind of just enough to live on.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
So you have to
for
go into it because you love doing it.
yeah, for benchmarking, we made £4 last month out of YouTube. So
Oh well.
yeah, I know. I'm gonna maybe buy some crisps.
Yeah, I think it took me 9 months to get my first payment because they won't pay you less than £60, or they wouldn't at the time. So it took me 9 months to earn my £60, and I still
Yeah.
remember the excitement. It's just like, oh wow, I've actually earned this. And I'd spent hours and hours and hours building up videos and putting them out there, and so per hour that was not a good payment, but
No,
it
no,
was
exactly.
the first step to where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. You have to put these things out there for enjoyment to begin with, and then stick with it for
Hmm.
enjoyment. I mean, we got professional videographers working with retro rides, and
Hmm.
we got our subscriber base, and they seem to enjoy the videos, and we enjoy doing them. But like we're not, it's not our day jobs by any
No,
stretch of the imagination,
no,
and that's fine because
yeah,
some like you might hit the magic thing, or you might suddenly, as you said, find yourself in a position where you're like, actually, if I hammer this now, I can get to that next bit,
mm,
which is exactly what Tim did with the Shmi 150. He got to the point where he was like, hold on, if I do this a lot more, I'll get to there. And
yeah.
actually, that's my monthly salary that I get from this job. So
Mm.
I can quit this job and then concentrate on it even more. And now look at him; it's insane.
Yeah,
And
and the beauty is it is so easy to do because the technology is so simple. You just use your phone. I mean, I now use an action camera for most of my recording, or a proper camera occasionally. But so much of my channel was just recorded on mobile phones.
yeah,
And the fact I could be at a show, I could do a live broadcast to the world through nothing more than my mobile phone. It's just extraordinary.
yeah, and also content is king. I think
Oh yeah,
that's what kind of works brilliantly on your channel and sort of others as well. Is that it is, as you say, it's just recorded on a phone. You don't need all the
yeah.
technology and all that stuff.
Yeah,
You
I
just
mean, if you're doing top end stuff, this is another reason I stray away from the top end stuff. If you're doing the really nice cars, people want to see, petrolicious style stuff apply to them if they're £1 million cars. But for the sort of cars I do, it's fine. But I
Yeah.
can't. I've tried doing stuff on Jaguars, and it hasn't been that well received because it's not polished enough for that audience.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
think,
my approach works
yeah,
for my cars.
definitely. That's again really interesting bit of. Sorry, we're going forever now. I don't care. But it's a podcast. It can go on for as long as it wants.
Exactly.
I find it interesting. You kind of need the right level of polish for what you're doing,
Mm,
and I think that there are videos out there that are massively over polished and over
yeah.
produced for the subject matter because they see these really well produced petrolicious type things. I mean, we
Mm,
do we're not far from that sometimes. As I say, it's naturally simply because the equipment we have and the people we've got filming with us. But Simon that works with us just goes to shows with his little GoPro and just
hmm.
records it on that, and it's every bit as good as us with our gimbals and our Sony's and Canon
Yeah,
cameras
and
and all that kind of
again,
thing.
it's partly a commercial decision. But I can't afford to have a small team.
No,
The numbers don't work, and this is why it wouldn't work for a publisher to do it because you need so many people involved to make a really good, clean and concise video. Whereas I can knock out my videos really, really quickly, so I can do a lot of them, and I try and do as much editing as I can on the camera to try and record just what I need. So I'm not having to spend hours sitting in the edit suite because it just doesn't pay well enough to justify that.
no, that's the
And
thing. You want like a sort of an hour edit for a 20-minute video, and then
yeah,
you're done.
yeah, and that's about where I am. So my stuff isn't very highly polished, but I've discovered that people don't mind that. They're not expecting TV standards of production.
No,
So to a certain extent, you can get away with it as long as the content is good.
and actually, sorry to bring Tim up again. For years, he used a handy cam that he got as a birthday present. Like
Hmm.
even when he had like I think up to nearly the point that he had 1 million subscribers or something, it was just a
Wow.
birthday present, a handy cam that he had, and he'd edit on his
Mm,
computer, and that was proof to me, even at the time, that it was purely content. And much as
yeah.
I love doing our sort of highly polished, highly edited videos that we do, like the stuff we did at SEMA last year and all that, and we'd had intended to do a load more of them this year at lots of UK shows, which never happened.
Yeah, that went slightly wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit wrong. That isn't what necessarily works. It's just what we enjoy doing, and we enjoy
Hmm.
making that product. So that's what we're going to do. But actually, to not labour the point, but you don't need all of that. You just
Hmm.
need a voice and a subject and a mobile phone and the work ethic and the enthusiasm for it. Because as you point out, you
Yeah.
could be doing this for years and not make anything out of it. You should never necessarily start a YouTube channel with the idea of making money, I think.
No, no. I started it very much as a hobby and thought, oh well, if I can earn a little bit of money from my hobby, so be it. And
Yeah.
thankfully, it has built up to where I am today, and I'm very grateful for that.
And I mean, I'm assuming you're still growing because you start popping up in more and more places. I find
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
as I
It's still
browse
going
around.
up. I think we've just hit 63,000 subscribers. So yeah, it's still a growing channel, and the
That's
number of
great.
views is going up. And yeah, and what I love is the community that's built up around it. And it's a nightmare trying to keep up with the comments, but it is so enjoyable to do because I just love that feedback loop. I didn't really get that feedback loop with magazines. You get perhaps a couple of letters sent in every now and then, but now everyone is instant with their praise or their derision, which is often deserved. But yeah, it's really good, and the vast majority of my comments are so overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, you're working in a niche that's only going to attract people that are probably enthusiastic about that niche. So,
Mm.
and more than likely, are happy to see that car being featured because it's not being featured anywhere else.
Well, quite, yeah,
So that's wonderful. Right, we should definitely stop this at some point. Otherwise, I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
going to be able to get
That,
another cup of tea. I need
mm,
definitely need
that's
another cup of
desperate
tea.
times.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ian. Always a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry we haven't been able to see you this year because
Yeah, it's been slightly frustrating in that regard, but
it's been a little
circumstances
bit
beyond
rubbish.
our control.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully beyond our control. Otherwise, one of us is in proper trouble. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
No problem.
Podcast listeners, I do not know who is on the next one. It might be Chris Pollitt, who is a mutual friend of ours. So that is the plan anyway. But
That sounds a good plan to me.
yeah, we love Chris, but been tricky to nail down. Both of us seem to be either away from home at alternate times. So
He is a busy boy.
he is a very busy boy. But yes, thank you, Ian, for coming on, and hopefully we will see you at a show, and we will get you on some video at some point as well.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Thank you very much.
Cool. That's that.
Excellent.
That was superb. I enjoyed that a lot. It's weird doing. I mean, you've done some interviews as well. It's a little bit weird doing them in that you kind of. It's hard. You've got to get into a conversation quite quickly. And
yeah, and I had very mixed experiences with mine. I mean, you chat to someone like Paul Cowland, Johnny Smith. They are, I mean, talking is professionally what they do, so it's very easy to engage and have a conversation with them. But yeah, I had a chat with Aging Wheels over in America, and that was a bit more stilted. It was a bit more difficult to get the conversation